Now that we've set up some AOVs for our render, let's go ahead and split this up into some separate layers to work on and render certain components individually. Now we have a bunch of AOVs in our drop down here, and I didn't use all of these for the final rendering for this project. I'm going to leave an example of these in the scene so that you can reference the setup for some of these different AOVs. But by the end of the course, for the primary render layers, I'll leave in a cleaner set with only the AOVs that I actually wound up using. And it is nice to have lots of AOVs to work with in compositing, but these are additional images embedded in your layered EXR file, and this will take up a whole lot more disk space. And personally, my disk space at home is a bit limited, so I do try to work pretty efficiently and not include tons of layers that I don't think I'm going to end up using. But that's totally up to you. And now let's take a look at splitting up this image into some separate render layers. And we're going to do some more work on these layers as we add more elements throughout the class. But for now, I'm just going to split this up into an environment and a creature render. And before splitting this up into separate layers, it's very helpful to make sure that you have your final settings and AOVs as close to what you'll ultimately want as possible. Because if you decide later that you want to add one additional AOV or change one render setting across all of them, then you're going to have a whole bunch of Redshift ROPs to update. That can be a little bit annoying. So I'm going to call the existing Redshift ROP test render, and let's make a copy of that for our main environment render. And when working on bigger projects with multiple shots, it can be really helpful to have a totally separate Houdini scene and project directory entirely for each individual shot. But because we're only dealing with a few shots in this particular scene, I found it easy enough to manage just doing all of the shots within this one Houdini file. So right now we're looking at the wide shot, so I'm going to prefix all of my Redshift ROPs with the shot we're working on. So this will be wide ENV. And I'm going to delete some of the ID passes that I don't think we'll need. For example, we don't need this color test attribute here. And I probably won't bother with this mask attribute for the riverbed area. Maybe I'll add that back later on if I decide I do want to do more compositing finesse. But for now, I'll get rid of that. And I'm not bothering with the Cryptomatte at this point either. I will leave in the beauty aux because that's very helpful if we want more control over the post effects, bloom and flare and such. And for the puzzle mats, I think I will leave this existing puzzle mat with the red, green, and blue for the environment, rocks, and water. But for this environment render, we won't need the second puzzle mat for the creatures. Now before I delete that one, I'm going to check a couple of the other settings so that we can duplicate this wide ENV ROP for the creatures, and then I'll delete those puzzle mats at that point after duplicating it for the creatures. And we did optimize some of our settings for our test renders, so let's double check some of those to make sure everything is in the correct final render state. Let's check the Redshift tab, and then under Global Illumination, I'm going to make sure this is still set to brute force, which it is. And then under the System tab, I'm going to bring back automatic sampling. So turn that on there. And if I missed anything else that we've turned off for our test renders, we may need to go back and fix that later. Yes, the motion blur. Let's turn that back on. On the main tab, this looks all good. We're not overriding the camera resolution, although we could do this if we want to make sure to force this to a specific resolution regardless of what's set on the camera. It's kind of up to you however you want to manage that, but I'll just leave the settings on the camera. And then under the Output tab and Common, I mentioned in a previous video that the way that I'm organizing my renders is under our job environment variable, which is also where I'm saving the HIP files, and then the render folder. And then I'm just creating a new folder for each shot that we are working on in this scene. And then let's add some subfolders for each individual render layer. So I'll put this in a subfolder called wide env, and then I'm also going to use that as the prefix for the render file name itself. but it's kind of up to you to create your own standards for how you like to work with this stuff. For larger projects with more shots and more people on your team, I'd probably go with a different way to organize these things. But for personal projects with just a handful of shots, I think this works fine. And of course, let's set our render frame range. I'm just going to Control-Shift-Click to remove the expressions on the start and end, because this wide shot will go all the way from 1 to 240. Now let's duplicate this for the creature layer. I'll call this wide creature, and of course we'll change our file path here to render to a wide creature directory and to a wide creature file name. Now let's change the objects for both of these renders. For the wide creature, at this point we may not need the puzzle mats at all because the creatures are going to be rendered by themselves, so we don't necessarily have any problems with extracting them from other elements, since the alpha channel for the creatures themselves will probably be enough. So under wide creature, I'll just delete those AOVs. I'm going to leave the Z depth and the beauty aux. And for objects, I'm going to copy the water and the rocks and the ENV, and we're going to use those as matte objects, which means that, if a rock appears in front of the creature, it's just going to render a black hole in that area. And some of this matte object behavior is not the same in Redshift as you might be used to in Mantra or some other software. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, because there are a couple tricky things with how they work in Redshift. So yeah, we're going to use those as matte objects for the creature render. And in this particular case, because the creature will probably never be behind the water, rocks, or environment, you could probably use them as phantom objects as well, but I'm just going to leave them as matte here. So the only object we actually need for this creature render is the creature itself. And of course, this light mesh that's coming from the creature's eyes. So we've updated the objects, and we've updated our AOVs, updated our file name. So I think we're all good on the creature render, and then for the wide ENV, we'll do the same thing. We have the correct file name. For the AOVs, I'll get rid of puzzle map B, which represents the creatures. And then under objects, we're going to put the creatures in there as a phantom object. Actually, you know what? Ultimately, we want these creatures to be phantom objects for this render, but I'm going to make them a matte object for now, just to illustrate how matte objects work in Redshift, and then we'll switch it back to phantom for the final renders. So now if we open up our Redshift render view, we can select the ROP that we want to work with. From the Houdini menu, select ROP, and let's check the creature render first. Now this creature render has finished, but it's not looking any different. With the environment, rocks and water, and the forced matte parameter here, you'd expect to see just a black hole where those objects are. And as I mentioned previously, this is one of those very non-intuitive things with how matte objects work in Redshift. So if we minimize our render view and go to one of our geometry objects, I'll just select render ENV. Under the Redshift object tab, under matte, you can see there's this option to enable mattes and to set the alpha and etc. related to matte objects. However, if we change this on this render env object here, and we enable matte and change some settings there, I believe this will mess up the display of the object in the environment render as well. So what I've always done here is create a new geometry object. You don't need to have anything inside this. This is only to set up our matte parameters. So I'm going to call this matte parameters. And I like making this node black just for visual indication here. And then back on our Redshift ROP, if we go to the wide creature, there's this matte parameters from field here that tells Redshift to look at another geometry object for the parameters that define how matte objects work. So for that parameter, let's point it to our matte parameters object we just created. And actually we didn't change the parameter values on this reference object here, so let's go back to that. Redshift object tab, matte tab, and let's enable matte and set the alpha to 0. And now after re-rendering this with that matte object reference, you can see that the terrain and rocks and water are now correctly showing up as just black hole objects. And you should check the alpha as well, just to make sure that the matte objects aren't showing up there. And if you look at the Z-depth pass, you can see that this is showing us the depth for all the objects that are included in this render, including matte objects. And I'm actually not sure if there's a way to exclude the matte objects from the Z-depth render, but it's not really a problem because we can just use the alpha pass from the beauty here just to cut out the portion of the Z pass that we want. And you can also play around with some of these other matte parameters if you'd like, but I didn't really need to mess with any of that for the purposes of this course. But if you want some more specialized matte object behavior, you do have some more controls here. Now, of course, we need to tell our ENV render to use this same matte parameter reference as well. And now when we re-render the environment, you can see the creatures are showing up as black hole objects as expected, but we do have this issue with the lights being visible from their eyes. Now, we actually don't need the creatures to be rendered as black hole objects. You have to keep your compositing order in mind when you're setting up these layers. So if we're planning to first render the environment and then slap the creatures on top, the creatures don't really need to be black hole objects on top of this environment here. And you could potentially run into some slight issues with compositing at the edges of these black hole objects. Like if you're doing some color correction, there could be some aliasing where the creature meets the environment here, especially if there's a whole bunch of motion blur or something. And that's probably not a massive problem in compositing, but it's a little bit safer if we just render this environment as a solid object and then slap the creatures on top of it. However, we do still want to make sure that the creatures will be shadowing this environment and affecting global illuminations and reflections and etc. And we don't want the creatures to be visible. So we want them included, just not as black hole objects, just as invisible things that show up in the secondary rays in the scene. So let's move the creatures from matte objects to phantom, so they're invisible and just affecting the secondary rays. And then we need to create a duplicate of that mesh light that we're using for the creature's eyes. So go back to Object Context, and for the RS Light creatures, I'm going to create a reference copy of this. And the reference copy is helpful because if we change the intensity or any other settings on one of them, we really want both lights to be updated with this change. And the only change we want to make on this copy of the light, which I'm going to rename No Viz, is under the Light tab here. If we scroll down to Visible here, so you can Control-Shift-Click this visible parameter to disconnect it from its reference, and let's turn that off and re-render this environment. And actually, one more thing before we re-render this environment, of course we have to tell our wide render to use this new light. So going to the Force Lights list, let's deselect RS Light Creatures and turn on Creatures No Viz. So now we can re-render this and see the changes. So now after re-rendering this environment, as expected, the creatures are no longer visible, their eyes are no longer visible, but we still have this contribution from that mesh light for the eyes on the environment there. And let's check our AOVs for this as well. And because the creatures are phantom objects, now they're not included in the Z-depth pass here. So that's nice that we have this consistent Z-depth for the environment. That can be helpful at the compositing stage without worrying about the occlusion from the creatures. For the puzzle mat, you can see the creatures are not included there, which is correct. That's what we want. And everything looks all good for this environment render. And for all of the other effects layers that we'll be creating throughout the course, you'll probably want to use this RS Light Creatures No Viz light for those, because we really only want those creature lights to be visible for the creature render itself. This is a pretty low quality image right now because I've been rendering this quite low res just for the sake of this video, But looks like we're all good to start doing some high quality renders, and we'll discuss some more rendering related topics later as they relate to the other types of effects that we'll be working on.